the Nazis, they had this meeting, and it was, I think, in June 1934, where there is a literary quote in the book where one of the Nazi lawyers says, the most useful material to do this, we found it where? In the US judicial system. So why? Because the US, according to them, had been able to innovatively craft racism into law. So they were inspired by decrees that restricted immigration to free white person, or the ideas of forcefully emigrating black people somewhere else, which were put forward by Lincoln and Jefferson. So while Whitman obviously is not going to tell us that there is a direct causal relation between the two, but I would nonetheless stress that there is certainly a Western colonial imperialist continuity.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Kalik and this is Dispatches. Much has been said about neo-Nazis in the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces, and the US and NATO's support for them. It's been embarrassing, to say the least. However, this isn't new. Collaboration between the US and Nazis and fascists is a pattern that stretches back to the end of World War II and NATO's founding, when the US and British intelligence services established a secret far-right terror network of stay-behind armies across NATO countries, made up of fascists, Nazi collaborators, and actual Nazis. For decades, the US and allied countries recruited, armed, and trained right-wing terrorists to wage a war on the left, all under the guise of preventing a Soviet invasion of Europe that never happened. This secret terror network came to be known as Operation Gladio. Gladio cells carried out false flag terror attacks, often indiscriminately against civilian targets. These were then deliberately blamed on the left. The overall purpose was to maintain capitalist control of Europe, to prevent the election of communist parties, and maintain imperialism in the global south. This pattern wasn't isolated to Western Europe. There was Operation Paperclip, a secret US intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to the US, and Operation Condor in Latin America. And similar false flag operations were revealed to have taken place in Lebanon. The scale of Gladio and similar programs is still being understood as more information becomes declassified. But what's already known raises questions about how in bed the US and its allies remain with far-right forces as they escalate Cold War 2.0 against China and Russia. Here to help us understand Operation Gladio and why it's still relevant is Matteo Capasso, the Marie Curie Research Fellow at Columbia University and the University of Venice, Italy. He's also author of Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamhuriya and editor of Middle East Critique. His work focuses on the nature and impact of US-led imperialism. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Matteo, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rania. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you back on, and I'm really excited about this topic because it's not often discussed. We're going to be talking about Operation Gladio and some other related horrible campaigns of right-wing terror backed by US and other European intelligence agencies. But before we get into the details of all of that, with conversations like this, I think it's always important to maybe set the baseline for what is your definition of imperialism, because obviously this is all related to imperialism. So it's important to remind our audience of the foundation of all of this. So very briefly, what's your definition of imperialism?
So I would probably start with the definition, which I think is the most apt for our discussion, and is the one laid out by the Egyptian Marxist thinker Samir Amin. Samir Amin has a beautiful essay in Monthly Review called Contemporary Imperialism. In this essay, you see that Samir Amin refers to imperialism as, the imperialism of the triad, meaning the United States, Europe, and Japan. And he talks about imperialism as a social phenomenon that walks on two legs. And it's really, I'm grateful actually to this definition because it was raised by one of your, one of your interviewee, which is Bikram Jill. And Samir Amin refers to imperialism as walking on two legs. The first one being the economic leg, so the idea of neoliberal policies that are forced as the ultimate and exclusive possibility of economic policy. And then he talks about the political leg, which is the continuous intervention, including wars against those who reject imperialist policies and intervention. Well, I would probably add to this a third leg, which is, the ideological leg, the need to manufacture consent, to produce that wealth of ideas that makes sure to reproduce the economic system of production in which we live, capitalism. Yeah. Now, and this is, if you allow me, when we talk about this these three legs, in a way, there is an interpenetration of each one of them. We can't really think, and I think this is what is important also about our discussion, is that we always need to link the part to the whole. This is when we are doing a dialectical analysis. We cannot think of the domestic and the foreign, the internal and the external. We're always doing a word system analysis. This means that the moment you change one variable, the whole changes. You can't just pick and choose what you want. And precisely when it comes to the military leg, so basically to the political leg and the military dimension to imperialism, we always think of military operation, but we really need to start facing the fact that the political leg can operate through covert operation, clandestine, false flags operation, funding of opposition groups that are way harder to track, because we enter a terrain which, it's very secret for the ruling classes. Obviously, the mainstream media is going to call it conspiratorial. We all know that. And so we really need to be careful in putting all these threads together and all these various elements to understand the legs that imperialism uses to walk and to maintain itself.
Well, that's a really important, it's really important to emphasize all of those things. And of course, that last leg you mentioned is probably the most related to what we're going to be discussing. But also, before we get into Operation Gladio specifically, where a lot of the theme here is this pattern, right, that exists throughout history, especially since after World War II, but you could even argue maybe before World War II as well, where you have the US basically actively collaborating with fascists covertly to try to destroy the left, to try to maintain its hegemony over the world. And I think that, when we talk about something like NATO, which is, of course, being sort of been rebranded in the last year and a half since the war in Ukraine started as this savior of freedom and democracy, there are certain fascistic or Nazi roots of NATO. So can you briefly discuss NATO's founding and those Nazi roots that in fact set the stage for the secret terror network that we're going to be discussing?
Yeah. So very briefly, basically in the aftermath of World War II, as you were saying, the US tried to consolidate a political and financial leverage over worldwide, becoming the major imperialist power. So it was a creditor to France and Britain during the war, and he was trying to restructure the world system in the wake of this deficit-driven withdrawals of European colonialism from Africa and Asia and all that. So what you see is that if we abide or if we follow the definition of imperialism that we provided, then you see that the US, in terms of trade, launched the Marshall Plan, which is so idealized and praised up to today, because we are told that the goals of the United States were so altruistic. But in a recent book, for example, by Chris Bale on the Marshall Plan, he literally lays out the fact that he makes really explicit that the plan was conceived by the military. And the main goal was to prevent the spread of communism. So while these new trade arrangements provided this sort of idea that they were facilitating freedom of enterprise and international exchange, you have the creation with Bretton Woods in 1944 of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, this is on the economic leg of imperialism. On the political leg of imperialism and the military one, this is where NATO comes in, because we also witness the necessity for an increasing military coordination, with the receding British imperialism. And this is, it is in 1949, in the aftermath of World War II, where the United States, Canada, the Western European nations basically decide to create a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which I am going to provide you the definition from the website so that everybody knows why NATO is
Non-biased here. We're not biased here.
non-biased.
Well, we are, but we're bringing it from the website. I like that.
Exactly. Its purpose was to secure peace in Europe, to promote cooperation among its members, and to guard their freedom. All of this in the context of countering the threat posed at the time by the Soviet Union. I mean, we can go on and on. I'm not going to give you everything, but the main idea is that the Allies committed to democracy, rule of law, and peace. Okay?
Sounds
now,
nice.
That's what it sounds like. But what we need to say that basically the idea that NATO was created to provide peace and to counter the threat of the Soviet Union translates into NATO being founded as an anti-communist military alliance. So, which continued, up to now. What is really important to highlight is that, and this is a completely denigrated and purposely forgotten part of history, is that the establishment of this military alliance had, against a power that more than anybody else had paid dearly to fight Nazism. I mean, researchers put the numbers of soldiers belonging to the Soviet Union between 11 and 22 million of people who died. This alliance ended up recruiting and collaborating with the same Nazis. So at the very foundation of NATO, and this is where, Operation Gladio comes in, whether we like it or not, we see the complete comfort of Western democratic forces to cooperate and collaborate with the most regressive elements of society, the same ones that committed the mass killing of Jews and Gypsies in Europe, namely the Nazis and the right-wing fascists. So, unsurprisingly, and when I was looking into this, I found this beautiful book by James Whitman, who's a Yale professor of comparative law, and he has this book called Hitler's American Model. And it's fascinating because we tend to think that NATO was included and collaborated with Nazis, which is true. But at the same time, the Nazis, in their very early stages, when they were trying to craft a judicial system that would lay the foundation for the white supremacy ideology, especially the infamous Nuremberg laws against the Jews, the Nazis, they had this meeting, and it was, I think, in June 1934, where there is a literary quote in the book where one of the Nazi lawyers says, the most useful material to do this, we found it where? In the US judicial system. So why? Because the US, according to them, had been able to innovatively craft racism into law. So they were inspired by decrees that restricted immigration to free white person, or the ideas of forcefully emigrating black people somewhere else, which were put forward by Lincoln and Jefferson. So while Whitman obviously is not going to tell us that there is a direct causal relation between the two, but I would nonetheless stress that there is certainly a Western colonial imperialist continuity. And I have to say this, you know why? Because we're going to get, as we get into Gladio, we're going to get into the use of massacres and bombings and everything. But in 1928, Hitler expresses his fascination for the genocide of the Redskins, saying that Europe should do the same to save itself. Well, this is a very important statement, because it reminds of the historical weight that Western civilization, European civilization especially, carries vis-a-vis mass genocide. Now, there is David Stannard, who wrote this book, American Holocausts, in which he documents the pace and magnitude of native people obliteration in the Americas. And there is a sort of consensus among historical demographers that there was an overall decline of 95% of people. What this means is that for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact since Christopher Columbus, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over. the destruction of the Indians of the America was and remains the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. So this is where we should start when we look at the Nazi roots of NATO.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was a lot of officials, particularly in Germany, who after World War II ended up staffing like certain positions in NATO, having been actual Nazis and serving in like the Nazi government, which is so insane, but I guess not at all surprising. So when we talk about Operation Gladio, then let's start there. Where does Operation Gladio fit into all this? And for those who don't even know what we're talking about, like what is a basic I guess a brief explanation of what is Operation Gladio before we get
Yeah,
into some of the more specifics.
yeah. So Operation Gladio basically, in a way, starts in Italy. Gladio was the name of the operation. Okay, that was given to the Italian stay behind secret armies linked to NATO and the CIA.
Mm.
And Gladio, the word Gladio comes, it means sword, and it comes, it's related to gladiators, So this was the name that was given to the Italian operation. And it is important, the Italian operation, because the Italians are the first one to officially admit or to reveal the existence of Gladio in front of the parliament. And this happens only on the 24th of October 1990, despite the same prime minister at the time, Giulio Andreotti, had literally denied its existence in 1978 in front of a judicial investigation. So what is Gladio is a coordinated clandestine warfare section linked to NATO, a secret army that had been set up by the US Secret Services, initially the OSS, which then became the CIA, and also by the MI6 after the end of the Second World War to fight communism in Western Europe. Now, the clandestine network was not just something, as I said, that was present in Italy, but it also linked to other European countries. We saw this, and we're going to be talking about Plan Bleu in France. It was in Belgium, in Norway, in Scandinavia, and all that. The idea behind Gladio was that in case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, the secret soldiers, Gladio soldier under NATO CIA command, in coordination obviously with each single state and their secret intelligence services, formed a stay-behind network operating behind enemy lines, which was something that had already happened in the fight against Nazism at the end of the World War II. So they would strengthen and set up local resistance movement in enemy-held territory, sabotaging supply lines and production centers of occupation forces with explosives. Yet, and Rania, we have to say this, the Soviet invasion never came.
Yeah.
The stay-behind armies, then what did they become? They became a very useful tool to fight a much more real and present danger for the US and Britain, which were the strong and organically connected communist parties. Because once again, we have to mention, I don't know why I have to mention this so many times, but communism did fight Nazism, despite all the attempts of revisionism. I don't know if our listeners know this, but every time now on August 23rd, we have to celebrate the European Day of Remembrance of victims of Stalinism and Nazism. And there is obviously there is an attempt to revision all this. So this clandestine network, in the
Wait,
absence,
real quick, I just want to mention, since you mentioned victims of Stalinism and Nazism, when they talk about victims of Stalinism and they talk about victims of supposedly communism, they're talking often about Nazis as well. Like that's included in their death count is Nazis. Anyways,
yes,
please continue.
You're
Actually
right.
absurd. It's absurd.
Yeah, you're right. And so the Soviet invasion never came, and this Gladius, this secret behind armies, became a useful tool to make sure what that no communist left-leaning political force could come to govern in Western Europe. And with time, all these units were completely integrated into NATO. Now, if you allow me, Rania, and I think that this is where I would really like to say this. In Gladio is not just these are the facts. But I think we need to think of Gladio as a way of living, as a way of thinking, as a way of operating. Gladio is something. This is why figures like Julian Assange are so important, because you cannot fight things like Gladio without whistleblowers, without opening up and going into the secrecy of these military operations of this kind of military tactical strategies that took place throughout decades. And so it's a way of thinking, Gladio, of operating for imperialism.
Yeah. And I think that, so there's a few things going on here. So Gladio, obviously, like primarily, obviously, this is all under the guise of, oh, we're preventing a Soviet invasion secretly. But in reality, what you have is US and British intelligence essentially organizing through NATO the stay behind army of fascists and Nazis and Nazi collaborators in all of these countries. And it's so widespread. And this is also just what we know, right? We don't even know the extent of how big Gladio was, but just from various declassified information that's come out and statements by leaders throughout Europe over the decades, we know that it was primarily used to what you mentioned, which was to maintain this kind of anti-communist control over Europe, in particular, preventing the democratic rise of leftist parties, right? Because
That's
like
right.
you mentioned, communists fought Nazis, not just in the Soviet Union. There was communists in Italy, there was communists in France. And I just want to reference real quick, like an example. One example of this is that in France, I didn't know this. This is actually, and I have to credit Asa with Stanley, who has a great
Mm,
Substack where he wrote about this specifically. So this is from his pieces on this. But in France, the French Communist Party was kept out of government despite winning the 1945 election. The secret army, the secret Gladio army there was called Plan Bleu. I'm sorry that I'm not using a French accent to say that. And it was used to help keep the communists out of power for good.
yes.
And it did in fact work there and in other places as well. And we're going to get to Italy, so maybe we can mention Italy at one point. But I also just want to note, I found this really fascinating. Operation Gladio was also used to maintain imperialism in the global south. And one example of that, again, I have to credit Asa with Stanley, is that the right-wing dictatorship of Antonio Salazar in Portugal allowed Portugal to be a major Gladio base, which was called, it had like its own army called Aginter Press, which trained terrorists for assassination operations targeting liberation struggles in Portugal's African colonies. So this went, beyond just what's happening
Yes.
in Europe. And then I
Yes.
just want to reference real quick, and before we get to Italy, and then if you have anything else to add, is on top of that, and again, credit to Asa with Stanley, the top echelons of West German military, intelligence, and political elite were absolutely riddled with senior Nazis from Hitler's
Absolutely.
regime. SS and Gestapo officer Klaus Barbie, directly responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of resistance fighters and Jewish people, was recruited by the US military's counterintelligence corps in 1947, hidden from the War Crimes Tribunal, and spirited out of the country. Barbie was instrumental in establishing the West German part of the Gladio network. So, again, you could go country to country, and this is just some of what we know. There's so much more that took place in this. And then we get to Italy. And I guess that's where we can maybe zoom in, unless you have anything else you want to add about any other
I
European
would
country,
like
Matteo.
to,
Please.
to go back on some of the things that you were saying, between France, the Aginter, because actually Aginter is, it's wild when you start really looking at this kind of connections. So on the German front, we definitely have Klaus Barbie, which was, the Butcher of Lyon. He basically he literally was responsible for the murder of 4,000 resistance workers and Jews and 15,000 people sent to concentration camp. But what's fascinating about the German Gladio is that he was not the most important Nazi figure. Why? Because there was Hitler's general, Reinhard Gehlen, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, that had started his Secret Service career under Hitler, and he became chief of Fremde, Fremde Heer, the Foreign Arms Fast, with the task of combating the Soviet Union. So what you are seeing, and again, Gehlen derived much of his information through the torture, interrogation, and murder and starvation of, historians put it to 4 million Soviet prisoners of war. Now, U.S. historian Christopher Simpson, and I'm getting this from his book, found in his detailed account of the U.S. recruitment, the U.S. recruitment of Nazis, that Gehlen was well aware of the fact that his war crimes had earned him the merit to appear on the blacklist of the Soviet secret services. So he basically knew very well, and he actually sold himself, rebranded himself to the US because he had the important information. And so there you go. You have basically two major Nazi figures which created the West Germany intelligence services.
It's wild.
It's just wild, and I know we're gonna get into more of this, but on the case of France, Plan Bleu was fantastic as a plan. And I mean, I need to draw these connections because I think they are really important, Rania. And Daniel Ganser refers to this, and then I went and looked at more into this conversation to show the strength and also the anti-colonial attitude of the Communist Party when that Plan Bleu took place. Because in the 1940s, 46, 40, you have a parliamentary debate where a woman from the French party, it's basically accusing the French government to shell the Vietnamese people. They're saying, the Vietnamese people did not shell Marseille, but you shelled Haiphong. It's incredible. And there is, and she gets shouted at. It's beautiful what she gets shouted at and say, couldn't you find any men speaking from your party? I know. And then she's replied, I never believed a woman capable of such hatred. And they start calling her a slut within the French parliament.
Wow.
And this is incredible. And, it's to show how strong this French Communist Party was. And when you look at the American ambassador private diaries, you see that he wrote, I told Ramadier, which was the socialist prime minister who was trying to set up a tripartite coalition with the communists who were very strong. The communists and the socialists that got the majority of votes in France in 1946. And he wrote, I told Ramadier, no communist in government or else. And, again, we see this kind of threats taking place throughout, in all these different countries. And again, on France, what we know, again, from Christopher Simpson is that there were other covert action beyond Plan Bleu, such as there were covert action units like Peace and Liberty, which are funded by the CIA with well over $1 billion yearly. But this Peace and Liberty, which I'm not saying it in French, carried out a CIA operation in all over Europe. There was an Italy CIA branch directed by Sogno, and we're going to go back to that, called Pace e Libertà, with headquarters in Milan.
Wow.
And this is where, becomes so important to think of Aginterpress. Because in these years, when Aginterpress is founded in 1966 in Lisbon, is founded by French elements directed by Guérin Serac, who was a veteran from the wars of Indochina, Korea, Algeria, and a member of the terrorist organization OAS, Organisation Armée
of American States. I like that you called it a terrorist organization.
A terrorist organization, yeah. So they directly reported to the Salazar regime. And, we know that there was involvement of CIA elements. Now, what is important is that after the fall of Salazar in 1974, Aginter moves to Spain. Who do we have in Spain at that time? Franco. And these contacts were strengthened with the key structures and figures all over Europe. And one of them, and again, we're going to go back to this when we talk about Italy, was Stefano Delle Chiaie. Stefano Delle Chiaie belonged to Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale, New Order and National Vanguard. And Guérin Serac was directly linked to the Piazza Fontana massacre in 1969 in Italy, but also, as you said, they were operating in Africa and Asia. In fact, if in 1966 Aginter is created, what is founded in 1966 in La Habana by Ben Berka? The Tricontinental. So
Ah.
we really need to make this kind of, we need to have a world system, a global understanding of these dynamics if we are really to understand what happened. And because it's not a coincidence that during this same time, Ben Barka, the organizer of the Tricontinental, disappears in Paris in 1960, in the 1960s. And then, it's still obviously, it is secret, we will never know, but Amilcar Cabral, one of Africa's, most important revolutionary figures. Uh, Guinea-Bissau was under the control of Portuguese imperialism.
Mhm.
So he's assassinated.
And it's on, and there's, I mean, that's just like one of so many figures, and we'll get into it. But, when we move to the issue of Italy specifically, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that there's so much more known about Italy, specifically Italy, France, and Belgium, from what I understand, is because
Yeah,
of declassified documents. But like, that's one of the reasons that we know so much more about Italy. Just some of the journalism that's been done on this, there's estimates that in Italy alone, between 1969 and 1987, 356 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured in the most protracted and traumatic terrorist onslaught in Western Europe outside of Britain and Spain. This was the so-called strategy of tension, largely carried out by armed fascist groups in collusion with and protected by the secret state. So this was Operation Gladio, and essentially these attacks would be committed, whether they were assassinations, whether they were attacks on military or police. In other cases, and oftentimes they were attacks, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, and actually like terrorist attacks. Um, uh, in many of these cases, if not all of them, it was blamed on the left.
yes,
But it was
sure.
fascists doing it. So actually, let's start there. I mean, I go ahead and kind of set the stage for Operation Gladio in Italy, and then what is the strategy of tension?
Yes, I mean, before starting, if I think this is important, we have to
Mm,
discuss the question of sources, because this is a very heated debate. As you can imagine.
mhm.
Conspiracy theory. What are you talking about? This, how can you base this conclusion? Based on what, basically? As you were saying, there is a lot of declassified documents that allow us to do so, but again, these are state sources.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean that, everything that comes to the state obviously is biased. No, but, state sources are not free and independent either. They represent powerful interests. So there's going to be an interest also to hide some things, because, they're going to reveal very dirty connections that they don't want to, they shouldn't come out. So as much as we rely on state sources, and there is a whole debate in Italian historiography, for example, to the extent of the linkages and subordination of Gladio and the CIA and the Italian secret services. If you just look at the state sources, you come to the conclusion that there was some kind of connection, but you can't really say there was subordination, or you can say there were human rights violation. Okay? Now, if we start adding to these sources investigative journalism, which is so important, Rania, on this point, or documentary produced by, for example, Alan Frankovich. There is a three-part, which Osa also mentions in his Substack, on the BBC documentary called Gladio, or the Black Orchestra by Fabrizio Calvi and Frédéric Laurent, which is in France. And then you start looking at the testimonies of key terrorists like Vincenzo Vinciguerra, Stefano Delle Chiaie, or even CIA agents like Richard Brennecke, who had revealed about the Iran-Contra affairs, the October surprise, and all of a sudden goes on the Iran RAI, which is the Italian state television, and reveals that the CIA has been funding a secret army in Italy. But obviously, it was completely discredited. The CIA came out saying we never worked with us and all that. So it's important to lay this out before getting and before getting into the discussion on Gladio in Italy. So
Mhm.
Gladio in Italy starts in 1947, we could say. Alcide De Gasperi, then the Italian Prime Minister, visits the United States in January 47 and returns with 150 million in aid. He had excluded the communists and their allies from the government the previous May 1946 to placate the Vatican and the conservative South, which had strong link with the mafia. As parliamentary, elections approached, you see that George Marshall threatened that aid would be cancelled if communists and socialists came to power. So this is, we need to set the historical stage for this. Now, it is important to see slowly the intervention of the CIA before in the Italian political arena, because one of the first campaign was in April 1948, when the US provided a huge backing for Christian Democrats and their liberal Republican partners. The CIA relied on all kinds of, of methods to undermine foreign leaders, regimes opposed, basically that they weren't communist. So the administration, and this is documented, by several historians like Sarah Jean Cork, the administration spent the U.S. administration spent $10 and $20 million on anti-communist propaganda and other covert operation in Italy. And this needs to be added to the $1 million that the Italian government, that the Christian Democratic government was receiving under the Marshall Plan through the Economic Stabilization Fund. So then there was this example of a US CIA infiltration letter writing campaign called Letters to Italy, where an American journalist and a leading figure in the Italian-American community, Generoso Pope, who controlled one of the most influential Italian newspapers in the United States, started printing form letters that could be sent to relatives in Italy, and more than 10,000 were sent, to basically tell them not to vote for communist parties. In March of 1948, and the Voice of America, the State Department radio station, also began an extensive propaganda campaign with a number of celebrities, including Rocky Marciano, Roosevelt, Frank Sinatra, which all made a series of radio appeals to the Italian people. So eventually, what you are seeing is that they are intervening and they are making sure that the communists are not going to get into power. Right. What happens is that also the Catholic Church becomes involved in this project. And I have to say this, and they start writing letters to their relatives in Italy, despite Pope Pius XII had originally taken an ambivalent position. But then, under pressure, he changes his mind and starts threatening people with the religious sanctions on the refusal of absolution. So please don't vote communist, otherwise this is going to happen to you. So what we know from official state sources is that Gladio was established with a memorandum of understanding between Italy and the US Secret Services in 1956 in November. But there is an explicit references to pre-existing agreements, so that basically what they're saying is that the CIA had confirmed all previous commitments on the matter between Italy and the US. So there was a continuity to the creation of Gladio. But when it comes to Gladio, and specifically to Italy, you also need to add, this is where really, when you look into the history of Italy, you think this is not normal. Why? Because you have to add the existence of a secret organization called the Masonic Lodge Propaganda 2 P2, which was founded by Pietro Gelli and operating between 65 and 81, the year in which the list of members and the lodge was dissolved. Entrepreneurs, including Silvio Berlusconi, parliamentarians, 2 ministers, generals of Carabinieri, generals of Guardia di Finanza, generals of the Italian Army, air forces, admirals, were all part of this P2 propaganda Masonic Lodge. And this is important. Why? Because one of the leaders of the 1976 coup in Argentina, Massera, was a member of the lodge. And while Gelli held an Argentine diplomatic passport. So what we are seeing basically, what did this Masonic Lodge try to propose? A democratic rebirth plan that aimed for an authoritarian turnaround and obviously was strongly anti-communist.
Of course. Wow. And then
So
I'm curious. Oh, sorry, keep going.
no, I mean, and what you see is that it is a relation that brings together the most reactionary forces. And as I said from the start, you cannot delink the internal. You cannot just operate with the external forces, internal forces. You need to see this as a whole. The moment you change one element, obviously this has an impact on the whole as well, and vice versa. So you see that they were absolutely comfortable to this NATO this Gladio operation to involve elements from a Masonic Lodge, the Italian Secret Services, because they all had an interest to keep communists out of the government. And in this, also criminal elements participated. And as we go through, we will talk about it. The mafia was central to this. Why? Because already from from the arrival of the Americans in Sicily, the Americans arrived in Sicily through the help of the Italian-American mafia and their relatives, which were drawing maps of Sicily for the U.S. Navy. But you will see also that the relationship between the U.S. and elements from the mafia is not new, because we know perfectly that elements from the American Italian mafia were asked to assassinate Fidel in Cuba.
Right.
And these elements will come up again in the case of Italy. They linked to these operations of terrorism.
And I mean, Italy did have, again, it should be emphasized, I think Italy had one of the largest communist parties in Western
Absolutely,
Europe.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and then so all of these attacks take place. They're blamed on the left. It's obviously meant to make the left look very bad, to decrease support for communism and communists. And something in particular that you had mentioned to me that we should talk about is the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro, who was a prime minister of Italy. That was blamed on the left. And actually, it's still in the mainstream is.
Yeah,
However,
yeah. It is blamed to the left, but basically what happens with Moro needs to be, obviously, as you were saying, historicized, because in 1973, the Italian Communist Party's Secretary General Enrico Berlinguer launched a proposal for a democratic alliance with Christian Democrats, and this was embraced by Aldo Moro. uh, Aldo Moro. Now, this alliance was inspired, and we're gonna talk about this. But you see, it's crazy that you have to see all these connections at the same time. This is why I don't blame anyone. But it's really important to understand this as a global phenomenon. This alliance was inspired on the side of the left in Italy by the coup d'état that took place in Chile on the Allende government when Pinochet came in, because they realized, okay, we can just take over and win. Maybe we should have an alliance here. There was there was a sort of a political alliance to try to see and all to get to power, but also the constant need to distance themselves from the USSR. And so there is this time of which didn't mean a refusal of communism, but it obviously meant that we don't want to be related to the USSR, because what's going to happen to us if we do that? Look what happened to Allende. Look what happened with in Greece in 1968 with a coup. So let's try to come up with an alternative. Let's try to get to power democratically and maybe find an alliance with the Democrats, the Christian Democrats. Now, the kidnapping and the murder of Aldo Moro becomes, which is also, it's the Moro case in Italy. Il caso Moro was basically a key event in Italian political history, because in March 1978, the day in which the new cabinet led by the Giulio Andreotti, a Christian Democrat, was supposed to undergo a confidence vote. On that day, the car of Aldo Moro, and this government was the coalition government between the Christian Democrat and the Communist Party. On that day, Aldo Moro, prime minister and president of the Christian Democrats, was assaulted by a group that killed all Moro's bodyguards, 5 of them, and kidnapped them. Moro stayed in imprisonment for 54 days, and on May 9th, 78, his body was found in the trunk of a Renault car in Via Caetani in Rome. Okay? Now, the official story is that the Red Brigades did this. A terrorist group from the left carried out this attack, and 2 main individuals were found guilty. At the same time, however, there are numerous questions that remain unanswered when it comes to Moro. And I'm going to present this, but if you'd like, Rania, we can go back to some of the previous right-wing confirmed terrorism that took place in Italy to see also the patterns here.
Yeah.
So the mysteries first and foremost are the most important is the snatch of Aldo Moro. The way the operation was carried out literally required, and this has been raised by many analysts, some military tactical knowledge which the Red Brigades did not possess. There is a recent documentary which is called Come è nato il caso Aldo Moro, and the Italian play on the word NATO here, but meaning being born, but also meaning NATO.
Mm-hmm.
Because they present ballistic evidence that were never taken into consideration, or for example the presence of cars, a red car in the moment of the snatch of Aldo Moro that was never investigated, and then was apparently linked to elements, foreign secret elements. So who could possess these military capabilities, to operate in this quick manner and do such thing? Again, no answer to that. We only have the testimony of Mario Moretti, who was at the time we're told a member of the Red Brigades, who basically was found who collaborated and took together with another member of the brigades, took the blame for the operation. At the same time, other members of the Red Brigades came out and accused him of being an infiltrator.
Mm-hmm.
There is absolutely, there is no clarity, but at the same time, what you're seeing is that this was a key moment, because after the snatch and kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro, the communists disappeared from the Italian political arena. So there are also the declaration of Moro's wife, which said that when he met Henry Kissinger in 74 and 76, Moro was threatened twice on the fact that, you have to put an end to your political plan, because you cannot bring all the forces in your country. Otherwise, you will be punished. Kissinger has denied that. And then, there is another strange death that took place the year after of a very famous Italian journalist who was assassinated with 4 bullets. His name is Mino Pecorelli. And Pecorelli dealt with Moro from on writing on his political career for a long time. And almost what is important is that Pecorelli was writing about the possible connection of the CIA funding the democratic Christians and the existence of units that were very secret, and they might have been linked to the murder and kidnapping of Moro. Pecorelli, as I told you, dies a year later with 4 bullets. And in all this, you see connected in the parliamentary investigation and numerous members of criminal organization, from Rome to Italians from the south. It's just it's literally a key moment in the Italian political history. But as I told you, it is useful to think of this as one of the of the most important moment of the so-called strategy of tension in Italy during these years.
Yeah, it's actually insane, and it's I know we're gonna get to the point of like relating. Like the important part of this is not just to understand history, but also to recognize how this is so prevalent today, and lots of things that we see. For example, what's happening in Ukraine. But before we even get to that, I think we should. You mentioned global. You mentioned that this is a global program. Gladio, in many ways, is like a way of living, a way of thinking. And so when we zoom out and look at the globe in those decades where all of this is happening in Western Europe, you have similar styles of Gladio happening
Yes.
in other parts of the world and entire regions, for example. Um, and I know you want to talk about some of these. I mean, there's Plan Condor in Latin America, which you kind of actually briefly mentioned, and with regard to Pinochet, who had a lot to do, who played a big role in that. You have the Operation Paperclip in the US, where Nazi scientists were literally like brought to the US to work for the US government. Uh, and then, we're even going to delve into something that took place in Lebanon that seems to be of a similar pattern in terms of these sort of false flag attacks. But let's start with Plan Condor in Latin America.
Yeah.
Why don't you give some background to that and why that's like a global kind of Gladio?
So the US, and this is where really we need to think of Gladio as a way of thinking and operating by imperialism, because the US Army opened in 1946 the School of Americas, uh, which was also, which I think we should call it the School of Assassins, to be really honest,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because 11 of these graduates became Latin American heads of state over the following
11.
decades. And none of them became their country leader by democratic means. They were all right-wing military coups.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.